bit about environmentalism and building solidarity and the problem with population politics. So environmentalism, that's a big idea. And I think that one of the ways that I think of it as big is that it incorporates a lot of things that, that people don't necessarily think of right away. For me, environmental work is very much about environmental justice, which environmental justice is not just a sort of green term tossed around by, modern non-profit industrial complex sort of national groups. This is a very specific movement led primarily by women of color that has come up out of decades of environmental racism and the strategic positioning of pollution and environmental degradation in communities of color and low-income communities. So environmentalism, which may evoke ideas of being told to change your light bulbs or sign a petition to save animals, also broadly includes this very social justice-oriented movement. And it also includes reproductive justice as well. And for us, I hate assuming that people don't already know these connections, so I'll be brief, but reproductive health and environment are intrinsically linked. If you want further information about that, we have these awesome publications here. We didn't put them up, but some really amazing allies did at the Movement Strategy Center, and they talk about organizations all over Turtle Island that are doing amazing work connecting reproductive health and environmental justice. But of course, our ability to make families, to work, to create, to have health are completely affected by the environments that we live in. So environmentalism, big idea, lots of different movements. And in some ways it is misunderstood. I mentioned that nonprofit industrial complex. There's a lot of people with good hearts and a lot of energy working in environmentalism. And sometimes, we disagree with each other about the ways that things go about. And one of the big disagreements that comes up for me is when people don't acknowledge the history of mainstream environmentalism, which is very much an exclusive politics. It's very much a white and elite politics, which doesn't mean that amazing people haven't worked in it over the decades that it's been around, but it does also mean that it's been directly linked to things like pushing indigenous people out of their land so you can have a national park, and then hiring them to come back in and impersonate different indigenous people for low wages. And all in the name of conservation, in the name of our great national park system, which Ken Burns can now memorialize and glorify, as in a way it should be glorified, through documentaries. And it also means that mainstream environmentalism has been linked historically to trying to separate, through this idea of wilderness and conserving wilderness, trying to separate people from their environments and create separate ideas where people's work, especially working class people, and people's need for food and subsistence are separate from nature and separate from the environment and can be viewed that way. So there are, in the big idea of environmentalism, there are these problems and these struggles of racism and exclusion. And one of the big things that comes out of it that really inspires our work is a very particular strain of problematic environmentalism, which also spreads to other ideologies, and that's population politics. So has anyone heard overpopulation, that word, overpopulation, ever?
Yes.
Yeah. If you don't mind us shouting out, what are some of the things that overpopulation causes? Whether you think that they're true or whether you've heard them.
Apocalypse.
Oh, apocalypse, yeah. Well, that's sort of the end. You can't say anything after that. But before the apocalypse, what does overpopulation cause?
Food shortage.
Yeah,
Pollution.
Hunger, pollution, sorry.
I've actually got to say hunger.
Yeah, hunger, yeah.
Water shortages. Global warming.
Yeah, global warming. Generally, all loss of resources, everything that causes environmental degradation, things that cause political strife. One of the articles we have on the table over here is called Youth Bulge. It's by a researcher named Ann Hendrickson talking about something that's been very popular in the media lately, where people, instead of celebrating the revolutionary youth of Egypt and Libya, are saying, this unsettling of political systems is due to there being too many young brown men in Middle Eastern countries who can have jobs. And these are very real struggles that people face, but it's put up as a national security fear, right? So overpopulation, boy, it does a lot of bad things. But it's an idea. How many people is too many is an idea, and it's a very changeable idea. And in the same way that someone can argue and feel very strongly that it's too many people eating food, it's too many people growing food, it's too many people moving to cities that causes, say, a food shortage, someone else might suggest that food shortages are created by very strategic economic policies and centuries of colonial development, and that actually there's never not enough food. There's simply distribution systems, and some people call them broken. I think they're doing exactly what they were set up to do, which is keep, some resources for elites and very few resources for everyone else who's working and struggling and trying to get by in the world. So that idea of overpopulation as the cause of hunger is one that I'm gonna challenge a little bit, and the idea of overpopulation as the cause of environmental degradation, climate change, and pollution, some of those other ideas, that's something I'm going to challenge very directly. I was at a conference this weekend and I heard someone speak, really amazing man, he's a biologist, and I respect his work very much. He studies biodiversity, and he feels very strongly, as do I, as do a lot of people, that we're in a period of massive species loss right now, and it's increasing, and it's dangerous, and it's really, poses a danger to our survival as a species, to the planet's survival in the way that we understand it. And so he showed at one point in his presentation, he was doing a PowerPoint, which unfortunately for you I'm not doing, but I'll demonstrate with my hands. There's a graph of the rapid acceleration of species loss that sort of continues at this slow rate and then spikes. And he showed alongside it a line showing human population, which of course, as we all know, spiked hugely in the 20th century, doubling and then continuing to rise, right? And so he graphed them right against each other, and it shows that, it appears to be a very causal relationship, and it makes sense on a very rudimentary logical level. More people, fewer other things, you squeeze them out. It's sort of this traditional idea of claustrophobia, right? We can all sort of feel what that makes us think about. But at the same time, if we take a step back, if we take a deep breath, we can think there are a lot of other things in that same time period that can be graphed against that line. There's the rise of industrialization. There's the rise of, just to take a small element of industrialization, there's the rise of chemical agriculture, which is the cause of, a lot of that population growth, because people had access to a lot more food and could feed their families with a lot more ease. And there's other things as well. There's colonization. There's a move to a very different economic system. You can kind of chart the rise of capitalism along the same curve. So you can do a lot of playing with causality and sort of looking at the many different factors that might be involved in massive species loss. And it's not as simple as showing that one line of human population growth. But it's important to sort of look at the roots of why we so immediately, at least as a culture in the US, why we so immediately attribute population or attribute problems to population growth. And sort of where this started, you may all know about the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who is in the 17th century, or I'm sorry, the 18th century, the 1700s, that's when he was born. And he was an Anglican clergyman who did some math, and he strongly believed that human population growth is always going to be geometric, and it's going to be unstoppable. So it's going to be, you're going to go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, indefinitely through the generations, unless something acts to check that growth, whether it's drought or a hurricane or colonial policy, because of course he was an Anglican clergyman living at a time when he was benefiting very much from colonial policies. And his belief was it was more merciful to let the poor starve and to have these sort of man-made checks on population growth, not because he wanted to save the environment, because that's a much later sort of philosophy, but because otherwise there would just be too many people for resources. People, changes quality of life, and it would become a miserable existence for everyone else. What we see now, of course, is that some of the people involved in human reproduction, who are now recognized as people people, women, will sometimes make choices about how many children they have, and that's not a recent, last 70 years or even Roe v. Wade, era issue. That's something that's happened throughout human history, that women have found ways to make choices about the way that they have children. And that they make those choices based on sort of a lot of factors, based on, do they live in a community where you need a lot of labor to continue, to grow your food and to survive and to have a healthy and stable life? Or do you live in a community where there's not a lot of support for elders? And so you need to know that you have a social support set up in the future. Or, do you live in a place where you have very little access to medicine and healthcare, and so you don't know how many of your children will survive? Or are you only recently having access to those things? So, what we know now is that yes, population grew precipitously toward the end of the 20th century, but now demography shows us that in virtually, I should say, every country on Earth, there has been a drop in fertility rates, and globally overall, we've gone from 4.6 to dropped in half at the global average. And in some places, that's not the case. In some places, people still face population pressure where they really feel the need to have larger families. And in some cases, people choose to have larger families because they want to and they'd like to. But overall, on the global average, does not show that rapid geometric sort of fractal growth that Malthus was afraid of. And yet his philosophy continues to impact us politically across the spectrum, very much today. It led to the modern eugenics movement, which people often associate predominantly with Nazi policies, but was very much a part of U.S. policy, open U.S. scientific policy. And eugenics, of course, is the idea that humans can and should direct their own evolution through restricted and selective breeding. So, I mentioned earlier CRAC, or Project Prevention, and there are efforts to pay women who were drug users or who were women of color to be sterilized. That's a eugenics-based program. That's a modern eugenics-based program. And these kind of programs historically are generally targeted at the poor, at racialized populations, and when I say populations, I mostly mean women, although of course women aren't the only people with babies. Trans men often have babies as well, and gender non-conforming people. But this is a very gendered, eugenics tends to be a very gendered policy, and it's aimed, as I said, at the poor, at racialized populations, the disabled, and also the immoral, right? So people who are in prison, people who are in sex work, people, on and on and on, or people who simply, make lifestyle choices that are confusing to elites and power structures. So eugenics, has led, and I think someone here is going to talk a little bit later about U.S. Campaigns against Native American women that went on until really only 15 or 20 years ago. Sterilization campaigns, similarly sterilization campaigns against the disabled have continued. I have some books that I brought here, American Eugenics and Conquest, two of those books, amazing resources if you're interested in learning more about either of those campaigns. But so eugenics didn't directly lead to the population bomb, but it's in some ways linked to it. And the population bomb is this idea put forth by Paul Ehrlich in his book of that title in 1968. And I call it his book. His wife Anne Ehrlich also worked on it. She wasn't recognized at the time. Now she's recognized as a collaborator and what I'd call, if I felt more affectionate toward them, a co-conspirator in his work at present, and they're still working very hard at what they believe. But this is a book that said, it said a lot of things, but I'll boil it down to one idea that was particularly important, which was that India was going to experience a massive starvation, a massive drought of just tragic proportions, inevitably, if something wasn't done to check population growth. It was going to happen in the 70s. It didn't pan out that way because something called the Green Revolution happened instead, which is itself a problematic and complex story of agriculture and changes and in some ways domination and oppression. But because human history and human experience is capricious and things can't always be predicted by demographically, this was something that happened that disrupted that narrative and changed the course of history that the Ehrlichs saw coming and were so very concerned about. And yet their work continues. And one of the ways it continues is through climate politics. And you know, everyone here is sort of aware that we're experiencing a shift in climate these days?
No.
Probably? Okay, yeah. We can open that up for discussion later in the Q&A if you want. But yeah, so there's really pretty clear scientific evidence that we're experiencing rapid and constant and perhaps at this point quite irreversible climate change, and that this is one of the key issues of our time. It demands immediate and massive action, and so people feel deeply moved by it, and I feel similarly, so I have a lot of empathy for that. But this has been yet another place where these ideas of overpopulation and population alarmism have again cropped up. And I think that it's important to look at these trends and look at the spaces where a particular fear reveals a particular element of thinking in policy and in elites, where that idea of, oh my God, there are too many people and they're using everything up, and soon everything, everyone will be coming for me and what I've got here and what I've protected and my little hoarded stash. And I don't mean to reduce everyone's fears or everyone's concerns around population to that idea, but I do think it's an important feeling that accompanies the continued resurgence of population in those conversations. So right now, a big way that this comes in almost innocuously in climate, well, I wouldn't say innocuously, but it pops up without people being malevolent in any way, in climate conversations is the idea of carrying capacity. Could someone define carrying capacity for us? It's not a trick question, and I won't tear you apart afterwards. I'd like to take a break from talking.
How much you can hold before something falls apart.
Okay, so how much you can hold before something falls apart, and it's a very, it's a scientific idea. It's, it's something that we use to figure out, what the carrying capacity of a given ecosystem is. The history of this idea of carrying capacity is a colonial history. Carrying capacity was a scientific management tool that was invented by French and British colonial administrators working in African nations in the 20th century. And this was originally a very simple formula meant to figure out how small an amount of land was needed to grow the least amount of food necessary to keep a forced labor force working and alive. So that's the root of the idea of carrying capacity. And I don't mean to dismiss it with that story, but I think it's important to know the history of things, right? So that's where it comes from. It's grown much more complex in its usage today, of course, because a lot more factors are considered than simply what it takes to keep people you've enslaved alive. And yet it doesn't take into account the full range of factors. Right now, when we talk about carrying capacity or when we figure out our, our carbon footprint, we look at a lot of factors. We look at the land it takes to grow our food and whether we, eat predominantly from the industrial agriculture system or whether we eat locally, whether, we have access to that kind of food. We look at the kind of transportation we use. We look at where we get our clothes. We look at a whole number of things, right? So in a way, it can be used as a revolutionary tool, but that's not usually how it's used. Carrying capacity is usually used to talk about not a small community or, or a country, but often it's invoked to talk about the planet, the carrying capacity of the planet, as if that were a knowable quantity, as if there were a finite number of factors involved in that kind of idea. The carrying capacity of the planet is predicated on a huge generalization of what kind of consumption levels people are living with. So carrying capacity of the planet really has to, in order to be at all intellectually functioning, it has to take, as an example, an average lifestyle, And you're not going to take the average of the majority of the people living on the planet. You're going to take, probably a median. So you go, from very poor to very wealthy, there's such a huge gap. We're going to kind of squish these people who are all living on $1 a day to one point on this line. And then we're going to put the other point on the line, the 400 billionaires. And they're both going to be points. And then we'll find, somewhere in the middle there, which, it's it's convenient, and it means that we can use this in our conversation. But what it does is normalize a way of living that depends on growth, it depends on consumption, it depends on and embraces and holds up a capitalist colonial system that, ironically, is what causes climate change. So I'm going to move in for a moment to the real ramifications of using this population alarmism in our activism. And specifically here I'm talking about environmental and climate activism, but it comes up in a lot of places. It comes up in day-to-day conversations. It's amazing how often it comes up for something that a lot of people talk about as taboo, and like, oh, you're not allowed to talk about population, and yet it's taught as fact in science textbooks to middle school students and high school students. And it comes up in the way that we talk about how many children people have chosen to have, or what kind of funding the US should give to different countries and to different programs. So among the real ramifications, and I think this is the big one that people often think about, is coercive sterilization. And some people say, you shouldn't connect all population limiting ideas to coercive sterilization. They obviously don't all lead there. Obviously not everyone who believes in overpopulation theory believes in coercive sterilization. I would never suggest that. And yet, coercive sterilization has been the end result of these policies and these philosophies over and over and over again. Because when you take a political concept like this, at a moment of political urgency, the people who are going to be designated as expendable or as the problem, who are going to be scapegoated, are going to be the people who have been explicitly denied political power and political agency, who have been, I don't like the word marginalized, but pushed out of the center of communities or exploited. And generally that tends to be indigenous people, women in the global south, and the same list that I gave earlier when I was talking about sterilization campaigns. But in particular, because I think it's important to name some of these, recent campaigns in the 90s, there was the massive sterilization campaigns in Peru directed against Quechua women, done with USAID funding, and under the Fujimori administration. There's a brilliant and wrenching documentary that just came out this year by French filmmaker Mathilde Damozel. It's available for free online. You can watch it. It's called The Woman's Womb. It's in French and Spanish, although I think there's also, of course, one that's dubbed into English, although the French and Spanish one is longer, so if you can speak French and Spanish, watch that one. But it's an amazing documentary. It speaks directly to women who were victims of this campaign. And there were also tens of thousands of men who were victims of this campaign. And I think it's important to identify that when you are trying to either just exploit or exterminate an entire group of people, it may have specific gendered elements, but it is directed toward people as a people. And so you look at Rwanda, where right now the government has identified a quota of men to be sterilized. And in some ways, it's easier for them to do that because there is attention to women's health, and there's funding for programs that monitor women's health in a way that there may not be for Rwandan men, as if those communities can be dissected in them, as if what happens to Rwandan men does not affect Rwandan women or Rwandan futures or families. Right now, our most recent Different Takes issue is by Betsy Hartman, the director of our program, and she writes about the backlash against Cairo. The Cairo agreements were sort of agreements that made explicit that sterilization campaigns, that quotas, and that reaching certain numbers of sterilizations, a contingency for funding, for clinics and for doctors, were not okay. That was a UN meeting that happened. But there's been a backlash against Cairo, and that incentive programs, like the one that Project Prevention advocates, and also on the policy level, are making a comeback. And that there are some groups, some large US groups that have, policy initiatives that have floated sort of test balloons around starting to return to incentives because of this fear of overpopulation, because there is a moment where this is a really fertile area for political action. There are a lot of people who sort of want to aim their fears in that direction. So I strongly recommend that article. We also have it online, free at our website. So the Return of Incentives article is a great one if you're interested in that. I would say also it's important to know there's an amazing activist living in Connecticut right now, named Gwendolyn Albert, who's been working in the former Czech Republic for years now, working around ongoing sterilization campaigns of the Roma. So this is something that it's an insidious and yet constant element of our politics as a global community. And I would say that another ramification that maybe isn't quite as horrifying immediately and graphically as those campaigns, and that's as it should be, is that talking about overpopulation masks the real causes of environmental degradation, of hunger, of political instability, and of climate change. It masks them and it distracts from them. And you know, I probably don't need to say this, but I never get tired of saying it. The real causes of environmental degradation, and specifically of climate change, are consumption, militarism, colonialism, and capitalism. And if we look at extractive industries, if we look at the US military in particular and its use of fossil fuels and its immense impact upon the global landscape, that's where we can see the space where there is room to make changes in climate change. And yet, the people who hold global power find it easier to imagine a world with fewer human beings, with fewer human lives, than it is to imagine a drastic shift in the way that a very small number of human beings currently live. And that's the way we're valuing human life. I think it's possible to get very historical in the way that we talk about big conversations around those kind of values, around valuing human life. We can talk, oh, well, you know, in the US, slavery, we can look at that as, you know, a confined idea, unless, of course, you've read Michelle's book on the new Jim Crow, or if you've looked at the prison system closely. But you can kind of, or you can talk about Nazis as the source of eugenics, and you can confine to these historic moments, these large values conversations, and yet they underlie our everyday politics, our personal politics, and our politics as a nation. Yeah, that makes me want to run outside. So it masks those, and it also, it promotes this divisiveness in our movement building that prevents us from moving forward. It promotes this idea, you know, really, all right, if you firmly believe that overpopulation is leading to maybe not all of the problems of climate change, but some. You know, maybe you are one of the many activists who think, well, okay, it's a little uncomfortable to designate women in the global south as the people there should be fewer of, since of course they're contributing the least to climate change, and in many cases are among the primary stewards of the planet. But what about, you know, maybe we should pass out condoms on college campuses in the US that we know are majority white and full of, you know, the highest consumers on the planet. And those condom boxes should say things like, use a stopper, save the hopper. And when you open them up, you can see that extinction is forever. Wear a condom, and you can see that human overpopulation is destroying land, water, and wildlife habitat at unparalleled rates. Unfortunately, with no information about other safe sex tips, except for apparently wear a condom, which only people who reproduce need to do, I guess. But this is a very lauded and popular campaign launched a year ago, Valentine's Day, and sort of relaunched last New Year's. I guess they know the prime moments for wearing condoms in this country. And it was seen as sort of progressive, right? Because you're not offering up poor women for sterilization. You're offering up college students for choosing smaller families. And you're telling them, you know, this is a choice you can make to reduce your carbon footprint. Well, really, what does that do? Okay, so the college student holding that box in their hand being like, okay, that is a really cute bra. And it's a funny campaign, and don't get me wrong, like, I love funny campaigns. They're like, well, I don't have a kid right now, so I feel pretty good.
I work instead.
Yeah, that's good. Of course, my friend got pregnant when she was 15. Idiot. You know, really what it does is it creates the same sort of stigmatization that already existed, and it embraces it. And how does that help us build a movement at this critical moment? Really all it does is say, if you don't have children, feel good about yourself and feel, you know, at the very least, a sort of condescension toward those who do, especially if they have more than two in a two-parent household, and at the most, an active anger and resentment toward them. Where, you know, one of the comments that I read on one of these campaigns was someone who found it very, you know, on the internet, I never read internet comments, but what I did, and it was somebody who found this really hilarious and said, well, you know, I drive a Hummer and I eat McDonald's, but I still contribute less to the planet than some soccer mom with a minivan full of Rugrats. I mean, as if that language isn't already embraced as a way of belittling women and their families, right? And so is that the mentality, is that sort of self-congratulation what we need to be encouraging? Is it ultimately, you know, yes, it may get people's attention to what you think is the source of the problem, but does it in the end build a community of activists? I would argue it wouldn't. And I would argue that the strategies we need for building hope and solidarity and building the movement we need to take action on climate change don't use this kind of population alarmist language because they have a longer view than that, and because they have a wider view than that in terms of who we want in our movements and whose historical oppression we want to make visible through our movements. I would say that for me, 3 things that we can talk about doing to sort of build that kind of solidarity is, first of all, challenging population alarmism when we hear it, you know, challenging it actively and fiercely in our policy and activism circles, and challenging it gently and lovingly in our families and friends. And also recognizing that we're wasting time when we talk about population. We're wasting time that could be spent in other ways. Every minute talking about overpopulation that isn't spent talking about golf courses and militarism and consumption is a wasted minute in the field of reducing climate change. That's my opinion. And I would say finally that if we really want to build a movement, what we need is immediate and direct action on climate, personally and more broadly politically. And what that means, in my view, is that we need to embrace climate and climate justice, relating back to that women of color-led environmental justice movement I talked about very long ago. Sorry about that. We need to embrace this as the civil rights movement of our time. We're all involved in a lot of struggles, and these struggles are linked. These struggles are linked to climate change because the people who are most directly, immediately, and dangerously affected by climate change are the people who are already pushed to the edges, who are already experiencing exploitation and oppression. These are the people who not only are going to feel the direct effects of changes in food prices, weather, access to various areas of their communities and the world, but also are going to be the targets of the policies that we design or that elites design to address climate change. And those policies may be just as damaging in some cases. If you look at, say, REDD, R-E-D-D, I won't take up any more of your time, but Google it if you don't already know what I'm talking about. Those policies and those false solutions may be just as damaging and just as dangerous to those communities as climate change itself. So unless we embrace this as a movement of movements, the umbrella struggle to all of our work and the civil rights movement of our generations, that would be a serious loss. I don't like to end on a big threat. I just realized that's how I was setting up that sentence, but I'll end instead on please do. Please do that. All right, thank you very much for your time.
We'll now have Dan Piper speak, and after that, those who've been to our forums, we like to open it up to Q&A. So any questions you have brewing, hold them until Dan's done, and then we'll open up the floor.
I want to thank Katie for coming and speaking, and I feel like I'm going to stand just because I'm used to standing when I like my. I don't want I don't want to be like. So Katie brought up a number of important issues that I think are really worth covering. What I wanted to say is in particular, like what. Okay, ecologist John Bellamy Foster talks about this whole overpopulation phobia as demographic Malthusianism, which is the idea that everything that she just talked about, that it's too many babies that are causing the ecological destruction we have. But then he talks about another kind of Malthusianism, which he called consumerist Malthusianism, which is basically laying all this ecological waste, again, at working and oppressed people, but not because they have babies, but because they buy products. And he identifies a very similar logic in there. And in all the elements that Katie just talked about within the environmental movement, I think you can see this as well. If you look at Bill McKibben's new book, Earth, he not only refers to Malthus and says, he used to be, for many years he was wrong, now it looks like he might be right. He also says that if we're going to survive basically ecological apocalypse, we're going to need to turn back our consumption to the point where a trip to Boston from Hartford would basically mean going on bicycle. And everybody's based on small towns. The only way you really see the outside world is through the internet and so on and so forth. So this is widespread, I would argue. The idea for instance, Naomi Klein, if you are familiar with her, she's joined Bill McKibben's organization, 350.org. And I would consider her someone far to the left of Bill McKibben, so the fact that she's involved on this bandwagon, I think, is of note. I would also, and it's significant because we're in a world where a huge portion of the human population is in want, is in desperate want, and so meanwhile you have these phrases like, well, people in India and China are growing at a really fast population, a fast growth population-wise, and they see the standard of living in the U.S. and they want to live like that too. And if they did that, that would destroy the ecosystem for sure. Bill McKibben harps on this really strongly. So what I want to do for a moment is examine the social relations that mediate all our economic activity in this society, and that is almost entirely ignored by all these theorists. And this social system is called capitalism, and I'm very glad that Katie referred to it and named it, because that's usually not done at all. So what is capitalism? Well, what's some aspects of capitalism? Let's look at two. Capitalism is driven by the compulsion to accumulate or die. Nothing is produced without the anticipation of profit. Each investor must produce the maximum profit possible in order to survive competition with other investors, whether it's Walmart, Goldman Sachs, ExxonMobil, etc. This means that growth tends to occur with each business cycle. No profit means no production whatsoever. Even a slowing of growth results in an economic crisis like the ones we're experiencing now. Idle workers stand side by side with idle factories, offices, farms, and other tools and resources as people go hungry and without basic services, because those who own the natural resources, the tools, and the capital necessary to put workers, land, and tools together can't see a way to make a profit out of this effort that is worth the risk. So an ecologically sustainable capitalism, that is, a capitalism which fails to pursue infinite growth, would mean starvation for billions of people throughout the world. It would mean a catastrophe for humanity greater than any of the ecological destruction we see today. Capitalism produces for profit, not for human need, primarily. That is, human need, if it is produced for, it's secondary and practically incidental. It can only produce that which can be exchanged for money on the market. It produces quantity at the expense of quality. Now, despite capitalism's relentless drive to accumulate, billions experience hunger, and the great majority of humanity lives in a state of near constant want. While capitalism is driven to accumulate, on the one hand, it must also create scarcity on the other. Why is this? Let's examine a second aspect. Anything that is in abundance cannot be sold on the market. So take the air in this room. The average person has enough air to breathe. Everyone here looks alive to me. If I had a bag of air and I tried to sell it to anyone in this room, you'd probably laugh at me and wouldn't give me any money for it. However, if there wasn't enough oxygen in the air for anyone to live off of it, I could make a mint from selling everyone oxygen masks. And if you then looked at the GDP, you would see a growth in our nation's wealth, even though by any objective standard, the life here would be impoverished dramatically. So as capitalism must constantly grow without limit, so too must it also relentlessly creates scarcity. Capitalism is driven to destroy abundance and destroy public wealth so that we can be sold an insufficient substitute or even a destructive substitute for private profit. The creation of scarcity has a dual purpose. It forces people to buy something on the market they otherwise would get for free, and it forces people to sell their ability to work on the market in order to obtain the cash they need to buy this new product on the marketplace. If everyone here had to pay $500 or $300 a week for oxygen tanks, I bet most of us would have to get second jobs or work long hours or third jobs or fourth jobs, fifth jobs as the case may be, to pay that kind of price tag. And you can imagine the kind of state you'd be in if you lost a job and you couldn't afford your oxygen tank. You would be desperate. For an earlier example of the phenomenon, we can look at the peasants of England and Scotland who were forced off their land in the early years of industrial capitalism by parliamentary acts and other means. This is in the 1800s. In losing their land, these peasants were forced to earn their living by working in the mills. So the creation of scarcity makes it possible to sell goods on the market, and it also lays the basis for exploitation itself. It gets us both as consumer and as worker. And so what we experience as utter ecological disaster is only another opportunity for capitalism to grow. In destroying naturally occurring public wealth through overexploitation, pollution, and other means, investors are able to sell us ever more commodities on the market, and employers are able to force us to work longer, more intensive hours in order to obtain the cash to pay for the new commodities that address needs and pleasures we once fulfilled without paying anything at all. Where farmers used to have nutrients in their soil free of charge, they now must buy fertilizers. Where workers used to get to and from their jobs on their own 2 feet or with public transit, they now must drive a car. Publicly owned and distributed water is being privatized or underfunded as bottled water has been introduced on a mass scale. Health that is destroyed by various pollutants is treated by a private healthcare industry. Preventing ecological destruction is not at odds with fulfilling human needs and desires. Capitalism creates the most rapid and destructive growth precisely by creating scarcity. And this unbridled growth does not necessarily have anything to do with fulfilling human needs. In fact, it creates even more scarcity of that which fulfills human needs. The fight to create abundance in all basic human essentials, to fulfill human needs, and to advance human and social development can actually mean a struggle against infinite growth and ecological destruction. In fact, this is what it must mean. Here are a few demands that I humbly propose that could help unify the struggle to fulfill human needs with the struggle to end ecological destruction. 1. Eliminate the U.S. military, the largest polluter in the world. 2. 30 hours work for 40 hours pay. The less we work, the less is produced, but working less is actually a benefit for us. It allows us to have more leisure time. Institute the right to a job. Worker control of workplace safety, the right to shut a workplace down when workers feel it is unsafe. If workers had that right on the Deepwater Horizon, it would have very likely prevented, at least in the short term, the blowout of the BP oil rig. Rebuild the cities. These are the most ecologically efficient places in Western civilization at the very least. Quality-free, abundant public transit. Walkable cities. The right to clean public water available everywhere. Eliminate the $24 billion tap water funding gap. The right to fresh, neurotoxin-free food, which means local, organic, holistically farmed. This could be achieved a number of ways. The right to quality, low-energy maintenance shelter, homes I mean. Free home insulation provided by the government being one such demands. For a massive public works project to bring the economy in line with ecological requirements, employing millions with high-skill work. Defend and expand public education. High-skill work means less energy-intensive work. Decommission and or convert fossil fuel industry and infrastructure. Put workers in the lead. Ensure that all related workers have jobs through retraining, conversion, or placement in a new job. Place corporations and banks under public ownership and workers' management in order to accomplish any of the above. A movement built on the basis of demands like these would expose how the ecological destruction created by capitalism is tied to the exploitation and oppression of the toiling masses. It would identify the long-term goals of ecological sustainability with the immediate needs of the social forces capable of making it a reality. This would include oppressed people such as peasants, indigenous peoples, unemployed peoples, but most importantly and centrally, the working class.